It was a cold, eerie night in 2019 when Jimmy Donaldson, better known as Mr. Beast, made an unexpected decision. Instead of the usual jungle challenges or deserted islands, he wanted to do something truly terrifying. He planned to visit one of the most haunted places on Earth, the Ohio State Penitentiary. This prison had been abandoned for years and was infamous for the number of souls said to still haunt its walls. Mr. Beast gathered his team: Chandler, Connor, Chris, Josh, and Jake. They were all excited, but also terrified. They knew they were about to spend 24 hours in one of the most haunted locations on the planet, and they prepared for the challenge by bringing along some ghost hunting equipment: EMF meters, infrared cameras, night vision gear, plenty of batteries, and flashlights. With their walkie-talkies in hand, they entered the prison. As they stepped inside, they immediately understood why this place was feared. The prison stretched over 250,000 square feet, with 6 stories and 100 jail cells. The walls were crumbling, and the air was thick with a sense of dread. A guard who had worked there for years explained the history of the prison to them. In the 1930s, a fire had taken the lives of 300 prisoners, and many had died in violent fights or by suicide. The guard warned them that the souls of the dead were said to still wander the halls. He also mentioned that the prison had a hospital and a church, both of which were rumored to be haunted. The warning was clear: never wander off alone, and don't joke around. Mr. Beast and his team, though anxious, were determined to prove whether the ghost stories were true. They started their journey by walking through the prison with their equipment, and almost immediately, their EMF meters began to beep and flicker. The lights on their meters blinked rapidly, indicating that something was near. This sent chills down their spines, but they pushed forward. They set up their base camp in the main hall, a large open area near the entrance, and then divided into 2 groups. Mr. Beast, Chandler, and Josh would explore the prison's hospital, while Chris, Jake, Connor, and Tariq would investigate the solitary confinement block, the most notorious part of the prison, where prisoners had been left alone without food or water. As Mr. Beast, Chandler, and Josh climbed the old iron stairs to the hospital, they couldn't help but feel uneasy. The creaking stairs and dark corners made them nervous, but they pressed on, hoping to find some evidence of the supernatural. As they wandered through the empty hallways, they came across a room with an old poster on the wall. It was a cutout from a famous movie, which seemed odd in such a creepy place. But when Chandler's EMF meter started flickering wildly, they quickly forgot about the movie poster. Then, Mr. Beast felt something strange. A loud siren seemed to echo through the hallway, though there were no alarms in the prison. Chandler and Josh couldn't hear it, but the sound was growing louder. Mr. Beast's EMF meter started blinking faster the closer they got to the source of the noise. They followed it to a room with an open door, where the meter began flashing wildly. Mr. Beast felt a wave of dizziness and a strange heaviness in his head as he tried to enter. Feeling lightheaded, he backed away, but something told him to keep going. Despite the dizziness, they pushed forward, convinced that they were walking in circles. They kept retracing their steps, and soon realized they couldn't find their way back. Meanwhile, the other team in solitary confinement was having their own terrifying experiences. Tariq, Chris, Jake, and Connor were investigating the dark, narrow cells where prisoners had been kept alone. With their night vision infrared camera, they could see dark shapes moving in the distance. They told a chilling story about a guard who was killed in this very block, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Chris suddenly felt like he couldn't breathe, and his head began to throb. Jake, who was focused on the room, screamed in terror. He saw a dark shadow creeping toward him. When the others turned around, they saw it too. The shadow disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, but they weren't alone. Jake felt a cold breath on his neck, and a moment later the shadow returned, standing right in front of them. The three of them ran out of the solitary confinement area, terrified. They quickly radioed Mr. Beast and his group, but they assumed it was a prank. However, when they heard strange sounds on the walkie-talkie, their fear grew. The sound of static was replaced by the chilling sound of a woman's voice. It was faint, but clear. "It's raining outside," she said, in a voice that sounded more menacing than normal. The group of three rushed back toward the main hall, but the rain was coming down hard now, and the sound of lightning added to their anxiety. The atmosphere felt suffocating, but Mr. Beast, though scared, remained calm. He began to joke around, pretending to be a priest in the old church, which used to be the execution room. He talked about the place being haunted by the souls of the men who had been hanged there. As the group laughed nervously, the walkie-talkie suddenly crackled again. Chris's voice came through, asking about their location. When Mr. Beast replied, the voice that came back was not Chris's. It was that same eerie woman's voice. She spoke in an unnatural tone, and Chandler swore he heard her laughing. The three of them left the church and headed back to the main hall, where they regrouped with the others. The storm outside was growing worse, but something felt off. They all felt watched, as if unseen eyes were tracking their every movement. Just as they were about to leave, they heard footsteps behind them. Turning around, they saw nothing but darkness, but they could still hear the faint echo of those footsteps in the distance. Could they really be the souls of the long-dead prisoners? They didn't know, but they had survived the 24-hour challenge, and their fears lingered long after they left. In 2019, the famous YouTuber Mr. Beast, known for his wild challenges, decided to take on something entirely different. For his next video, he chose to face his fears and spend 24 hours in the Ohio State Penitentiary, a place infamous for its terrifying history and ghost stories. His team, Chandler, Chris, Jake, Tariq, Connor, and Josh, hesitated, but eventually agreed to join him on the eerie adventure. This prison, abandoned for decades, was known as one of the most haunted locations in the world. With 6 floors, over 100 cells, and a dark past, it was the perfect setting for a horror-filled challenge. They packed their gear: EMF meters, night vision cameras, motion sensors, walkie-talkies, and extra flashlights. They felt confident as they arrived, but the sight of the massive decaying structure quickly drained their excitement. A local caretaker, an elderly man who had worked around the prison for years, greeted them at the gates. He warned them about the strange things that often happened there: whispers in empty hallways, the sound of chains dragging across the floors, and doors slamming shut on their own. "Stick together," he said gravely. "Once you get separated here, it's hard to find your way back." With a nervous laugh, Mr. Beast reassured his team that everything would be fine, and they entered the prison. The air inside was damp and cold, and the smell of decay lingered everywhere. Their footsteps echoed as they walked through the dark, empty corridors. To start the challenge, they explored the main cell block together. Their EMF meters lit up almost immediately, indicating the presence of something or someone. Nervous but curious, they set up their base camp in the prison's cafeteria, where they unpacked their equipment and discussed their plan. After some time, They split into two groups. Mr. Beast, Chandler, and Josh headed to the old hospital wing, while Chris, Jake, Connor, and Tariq made their way to the solitary confinement area. Both locations had reputations for being haunted hotspots. Group 1, the hospital wing. As Mr. Beast and his team climbed the rusty stairs to the hospital, the temperature seemed to drop. Their flashlights flickered, and Chandler joked nervously, "This feels like the start of every horror movie ever." The hallway was lined with broken beds and rusted medical equipment. The group stopped in one room when their EMF meters began blinking. "There's something here," Josh whispered. Suddenly a loud metallic clang echoed down the hallway. They froze. "Did you hear that?" Mr. Beast asked. The sound came again, louder this time, as if someone, or something, was slamming a metal door shut. They followed the noise, their footsteps hesitant, until they reached an operating room. The EMF meters went wild, flashing red. As they stood there, the temperature dropped further, and Chandler swore he felt something brush against his shoulder. "I'm not imagining that," he muttered, clutching his flashlight tightly. Suddenly their walkie-talkie crackled to life. A faint voice whispered, "Leave." Group 2. Solitary confinement. Meanwhile, the others were deep in the solitary confinement wing, where prisoners had been locked away in isolation for weeks at a time. The cells were small and cold, with heavy iron doors. As they moved through the narrow hallway, Jake stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Everyone went silent. There it was again, a faint tapping sound coming from one of the cells. They pointed their flashlights toward the noise, but the cell was empty. Chris decided to step inside, despite Jake's protests. The room was pitch black, and as he looked around, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Just then, the cell door slammed shut behind him. "Hey, let me out!" Chris yelled, banging on the door. Connor and Tariq rushed to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. From inside the cell, Chris screamed, "There's someone in here!" Finally, the door creaked open on its own, and Chris stumbled out, pale and shaking. "I felt it," he said. "Something was in there with me." The church. As the night wore on, both groups met back at the cafeteria. They shared their experiences, and Mr. Beast suggested they check out the church, a part of the prison that had once been used as an execution chamber. Despite their fear, the group agreed. The church was dark and eerie, with rows of broken pews and a dusty altar. A large noose still hung from the ceiling, a grim reminder of the executions that had taken place there. Mr. Beast, trying to lighten the mood, stood at the altar and pretended to give a sermon. "Welcome to the Haunted Challenge," he joked. But as he spoke, the candles on the altar flickered, and a strange shadow appeared on the wall behind him. "Jimmy, stop!" Chandler shouted. The shadow moved across the wall, taking the shape of a tall figure. Suddenly, the walkie-talkie in Tariq's hand began to emit static, followed by a woman's voice. "It's raining outside," the voice said, soft but chilling. Everyone froze. The voice repeated the phrase, this time louder, followed by a sinister laugh. Terrified, the group ran back to their base camp. As they gathered their belongings, they noticed the sound of rain pounding on the roof. It hadn't been raining when they entered. The final hours. The group decided to stick together for the remainder of the night. They huddled in the cafeteria, too scared to continue exploring. The sounds of footsteps echoed through the hallways, though no one was there. Doors creaked open and shut, and faint whispers filled the air. When dawn finally broke, they made their way to the exit. As they stepped outside, the caretaker was waiting for them. "You made it," he said with a sly smile. As they drove away, none of them spoke. They had completed the 24-hour challenge, but they left with more questions than answers. Had they encountered real spirits, or was their imagination playing tricks on them? Mr. Beast uploaded the video a week later, and it became one of his most viewed videos ever. But to this day, he and his team rarely talk about what really happened inside the Ohio State Penitentiary. In the summer of 2021, YouTube superstar Mr. Beast decided to take his challenges to a terrifying new level. Known for pushing limits, he proposed a bold idea: spending 24 hours in the infamous Ohio State Penitentiary, one of the most haunted places in the world. His friends Chandler, Chris, Jake, Tariq, Josh, and Connor were hesitant, but their curiosity outweighed their fear. They prepared thoroughly, packing night vision cameras, EMF meters, flashlights, walkie-talkies, and even thermal imaging equipment. "We're going to catch something on camera," Mr. Beast said confidently as they arrived at the massive, decaying structure. The prison's dark history was enough to send shivers down their spines. Built in the early 1900s, it had housed thousands of criminals before shutting down decades ago. Fires, riots, and mysterious deaths had claimed the lives of over 300 prisoners. Locals whispered about restless spirits that still roamed its halls. The group was greeted by a middle-aged tour guide who shared chilling tales of ghost sightings and eerie experiences. "Stick together," the guide warned. "This place doesn't like it when people wander off alone." Despite the warning, Mr. Beast and his team laughed nervously and stepped inside. The first encounter. The air inside was thick and musty. Their footsteps echoed through the cavernous hallways, and the dim light from their flashlights barely pierced the darkness. As they reached the first cell block, Chandler's EMF meter lit up. "All ready?" he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It's probably just old wiring," Josh said, trying to stay calm. But the prison had been abandoned for years. There was no power running through it. Suddenly, the sound of metal scraping against concrete echoed from deeper in the cell block. Everyone froze. "Did you hear that?" Connor whispered. They followed the noise cautiously, their cameras recording everything. At the end of the hallway, they found a rusted cell door slightly ajar. When Mr. Beast pushed it open, a loud bang rang out behind them. They spun around, but there was nothing there. "Welcome to the haunted prison," Mr. Beast joked, though his smile was strained. Splitting up. After setting up their base camp in the prison's main cafeteria, they decided to split into two groups. Mr. Beastin, Chandler, and Tariq would explore the execution chamber, while Chris, Jake, Connor, and Josh headed to the hospital wing. Group 1, Execution Chamber. The execution chamber was a cold, eerie room with a single chair bolted to the floor. The noose that had once hung above it was gone, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. As they set up their equipment, the EMF meter began to blink erratically. "Looks like someone's still here," Tariq said nervously. Suddenly, the room filled with the faint sound of whispering. "Do you hear that?" Chandler asked, his voice barely audible. The whispers grew louder, forming words they couldn't quite understand. Then out of nowhere, a loud knock came from the far corner of the room. The group turned their flashlights toward the sound, but the corner was empty. "Let's get out of here," Chandler said, his voice shaking. But as they turned to leave, the heavy door slammed shut. They pulled at it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. Just as panic began to set in, the door creaked open on its own. They bolted back to the base camp, their bravado replaced by fear. Group 2, Hospital Wing. The hospital wing was even more unsettling. Broken gurneys and rusted medical tools were scattered throughout the rooms, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air as Chris and his group moved cautiously down the hallway. Their night vision camera picked up a faint figure at the end of the corridor. It was humanoid, but translucent, and it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Did you see that?" Jake asked, his hands shaking as he pointed the camera. Connor nodded. It was right there. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. They turned around, but the hallway was empty. "Let's keep moving," Chris said, though his voice betrayed his unease. They entered a room labeled morgue and immediately felt a chill. Jake's flashlight flickered, and then the room went completely dark. When the lights came back on, one of the gurneys had moved to the center of the room. "That wasn't there before," Josh said, his voice barely a whisper. The group decided they'd had enough and hurried back to the base camp. The final test back at the cafeteria, the two groups shared their experiences, and it was clear they were all shaken. But Mr. Beast wasn't ready to give up just yet. He suggested they check out the solitary confinement wing, known as the hot spot, for paranormal activity. The narrow hallway of solitary confinement was suffocating. Each tiny cell felt like a tomb. As they walked, they heard faint sobbing coming from one of the cells. "Is someone there?" Chris called out, but there was no response. When they reached the end of the hallway, they found a cell with the door wide open. Inside, scrawled on the wall, were the words, "Leave now." The group didn't need any more convincing. They turned and ran back to the cafeteria, grabbed their gear, and made a beeline for the exit. The aftermath. As they stepped outside into the dawn light, they felt a wave of relief. They had completed the challenge, but none of them felt victorious. When they reviewed the footage later, they found things they hadn't noticed at the time. Shadows moving in the background, faint voices on the audio, and, in one chilling frame, the face of a man peering out from one of the cells. The video became one of Mr. Beast's most watched uploads, but the team rarely spoke about the experience. For them, the Ohio State Penitentiary wasn't just a haunted prison. It was a place where the line between the living and the dead had blurred. In the summer of 2022, Mr. Beast, the king of YouTube challenges, wanted to take his content to another level. His idea? Spending an entire night in a location infamous for its supernatural activity, the abandoned Ohio State Penitentiary. The massive prison had a sinister reputation, known for its eerie atmosphere and spine-chilling paranormal events. Mr. Beast's crew, Chandler, Chris, Jake, Tarek, Connor, and Josh, was both excited and nervous. Each carried an assortment of ghost-hunting gadgets, EMF meters, night vision cameras, walkie-talkies, and flashlights. They also brought a backup generator, just in case things got too dark for comfort. As the group approached the decaying prison, its towering walls and rusted gates loomed over them like a scene from a horror movie. The local guide who greeted them looked pale and uneasy. "This place is not a playground," the guide warned. "Many have come here and left with stories they wish they hadn't lived. Stick together and don't anger whatever still lingers inside." Ignoring the warning, Mr. Beast smiled for the camera and led his team inside. The unsettling start. The air inside the prison was heavy, carrying a scent of mildew and rust. Their footsteps echoed eerily as they moved through the empty corridors. The prison, once home to thousands of inmates, now stood in silent decay. Chandler, holding the EMF meter, froze when the device began to flicker. Guys, we've got activity already." They looked around nervously. but there was nothing visible. "Relax," Mr. Beast said. "This is what we're here for." Suddenly, a loud clanging noise came from deeper in the building. The team jumped, their nerves already fraying. "It's probably just the wind," Chris muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Setting up camp. The group chose the cafeteria as their base camp. The vast, empty room was unsettling, with overturned tables and chairs scattered around. After a quick discussion, they decided to split up. Mr. Beast, Chandler, and Tariq would explore the upper levels, where the old hospital was located. Chris, Jake, Connor, and Josh would venture into the underground solitary confinement cells. The upper levels. The hospital wing was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and peeling paint. Medical equipment lay abandoned, and the faint smell of antiseptic lingered in the air. As they moved through the wing, the EMF meter began to beep erratically. "We're not alone," Chandler said nervously. Suddenly they heard the sound of a gurney rolling down the hallway. They turned, only to find an empty corridor. "Did anyone else hear that?" Tarak whispered. They followed the sound to a large room filled with rusted beds. One of the beds began to shake violently, as if an invisible force was trying to flip it over. "Okay, that's enough hospital for me," Chandler said, backing away. Mr. Beast, however, was intrigued. He pointed his camera at the shaking bed, determined to capture the moment. But as he stepped closer, the bed stopped. The room fell silent, and an icy chill swept over them. "Let's head back," Tariq urged, and this time, even Mr. Beast agreed. The underground cells. Meanwhile, in the solitary confinement wing, Chris and his group faced their own horrors. The cells were cramped and pitch black, with heavy doors that seemed to groan under their own weight. As they ventured deeper, Jake's flashlight began to flicker. "Great, now my flashlight's dying," he said, shaking it. But it wasn't just the flashlight. The air grew colder, and a deep, guttural moan echoed through the corridor. "Did you hear that?" Connor whispered, his voice trembling. They turned a corner and came face to face with a shadowy figure. It was tall and humanoid, but its features were blurred, as if it didn't belong to this world. The figure took a step forward, and the group bolted, screaming as they ran back toward the cafeteria. The final encounter, back at base camp, both groups shared their experiences. It was clear that whatever haunted the prison wasn't just stories. Despite their fear, Mr. Beast suggested one last challenge: exploring the execution chamber. The chamber was a stark, ominous room with a single chair in the center. The air was suffocating, and an oppressive silence filled the space. As they set up their cameras, the EMF meter spiked wildly. "This place is definitely active," Mr. Beast said, though his voice wavered. Suddenly, the chair in the center of the room began to creak. Then, as if propelled by an invisible force, it tipped over. A deep, echoing voice boomed through the room. "Leave." The team froze, their fear paralyzing them. Then, as if on cue, all their devices shut off. Cameras, flashlights, even the backup generator. In the pitch darkness, they heard footsteps approaching. "Run!" Chandler shouted, and they sprinted out of the chamber, not stopping until they reached the prison's exit. The escape. The group burst into the early morning light, panting and wide-eyed that they had survived the night, but the experience had left them shaken. When they reviewed their footage later, they found unexplainable phenomena: shadows moving without a source, faint whispers, and in one frame, a face staring at them from behind the prison bars. The video became a massive hit, but the team vowed never to return to Ohio State Penitentiary. Some challenges, they realized, were better left untouched. In 2023, Mr. Beast, always looking for new ways to entertain his millions of followers, set out to do something more terrifying than any of his past challenges. Instead of filming a light-hearted competition on a private island or in the wilderness, he chose something far more sinister. A night in Ohio State Penitentiary, known as one of the most haunted prisons in the world. Along with his crew, Chandler, Connor, Chris, Jake, Josh, and Tariq, they packed all the necessary ghost hunting equipment: EMF detectors, infrared cameras, motion sensors, walkie-talkies, and a ton of extra batteries. The eerie atmosphere of the prison, standing in decay after years of abandonment, was the perfect backdrop for what was to come. When they arrived at the prison gates, the guide, a local historian, warned them about the tragic history that haunted the place. He mentioned a fire in the 1930s that claimed 300 lives, and spoke of countless prisoners who died under horrific circumstances, either in violent clashes or by their own hands. The guide swore he had felt ghostly presences numerous times while working in the prison. "Keep together," he advised. "Don't get separated, and stay away from the hospital and church sections. Trust me, you'll regret it if you don't listen." Inside the prison walls, deterred, Mr. Beast and his crew ventured inside. The tall, crumbling walls of the penitentiary loomed above them as they stepped into the eerie silence of the prison. Every hallway stretched into darkness, and the old iron doors creaked like they hadn't been opened in decades. Chandler carried the EMF meter, and it immediately began to beep, signaling that something was nearby. "Not a good sign," Chandler muttered. The crew pushed deeper into the prison, the flicker of their flashlights illuminating the forgotten corners of the building. The floor was cold, and the air felt thick with the weight of history. After exploring a few empty cells, they decided to set up camp in the center of the prison, the main hall. The space was massive, filled with the echoes of their voices. With the cameras rolling, Mr. Beast announced that the team would split into two groups to explore different parts of the prison. Mr. Beast, Chandler, and Tariq would check out the old hospital, while Chris, Jake, Connor, and Josh would investigate the solitary confinement section. The hospital wing. The hospital, with its rusted medical equipment and broken windows, was even more unsettling in person than it appeared on camera. The floor creaked under their steps, and the air felt colder as they moved deeper into the wing. As they walked through the abandoned hallways, the EMF meter began to go off, flashing erratically. "We're not alone," Mr. Beast remarked with a nervous chuckle. Then, a strange, distant sound echoed through the corridors, a faint metallic clang. The crew stopped in their tracks, looking around. It was as if the building itself was responding to their presence. They continued exploring, but the hospital seemed to stretch on forever, each turn leading them to more dark hallways. Then, they reached a room filled with old medical tools. Chandler reached out to touch one of the abandoned devices, but as soon as his fingers brushed the metal, the room temperature dropped dramatically. Chandler quickly withdrew his hand, but the temperature remained unnervingly low. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hall, and all three of them jumped. "I'm done with this," Tariq said, but Mr. Beast pushed forward. They followed the sounds, determined to uncover the source, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The solitary confinement block. Meanwhile, Chris, Jake, Connor, and Josh were deep inside the solitary confinement block. This area was notorious for housing prisoners in total isolation, sometimes without food or water. The walls seemed to close in on them as they walked through the narrow, claustrophobic hallways. They set up a night vision camera and began to speak about the prison's dark past, when suddenly a strange shadow flickered across the wall. Jake froze. "Did anyone else see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. They turned around, but the shadow was gone. They laughed nervously, chalking it up to their imagination, but the atmosphere in the block grew more tense. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, though no windows were open. Chris felt a strange pressure on his chest, as if the air itself was thickening. "Something's not right here," he said. Then the door of one of the cells creaked open by itself. "This isn't funny anymore," Jake said, his eyes wide with fear. Without warning, a black mist filled the corridor, swirling around them. The team rushed to get out, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, leading them in circles. They were lost. Strange phenomena. Back in the main hall, Mr. Beast and the others were beginning to worry. "I think we should check on the others," Mr. Beast said. The walkie-talkie crackled to life just as they started to head out. "Mr. Beast, get back to base camp, now," came Chris's voice, full of panic. The connection cut off suddenly. The team rushed back to the main hall, but found it nearly impossible to navigate the labyrinthine hallways. It felt as if the building was shifting, twisting them in different directions. Meanwhile, Chris, Jake, Connor, and Josh were still lost in the dark. The black mist now swirling around them. They heard faint whispers in the distance, voices that sounded as though they were calling their names. A terrifying discovery. After what felt like an eternity, the teams finally reunited. They all made their way toward the exit, but as they passed through the prison's long hallways, they heard one final sound, a loud thump coming from behind them. They turned, and for just a moment, saw a figure in the shadows, a tall, emaciated figure with hollow eyes staring at them. The figure stepped forward, but as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. The entire crew was frozen, their hearts pounding. Without a word, they sprinted to the exit, not daring to look back. Leaving the prison. Once they were outside and back in the daylight, the tension slowly started to release. But all of them knew that what they had experienced was something they would never forget. They had come in hoping for a thrilling challenge, but what they found in Ohio State Penitentiary was far beyond anything they had ever imagined. As they packed up and left the haunted grounds behind, they reviewed the footage. What they saw on the cameras only confirmed their worst fears. Strange shadows, distorted voices, and moments where the atmosphere seemed to change inexplicably. In the year 1900, a young man named Jimmy Donaldson, better known as Mr. Beast, was embarking on a journey that would be unlike any of his previous challenges. It was no longer about grand giveaways or survival games. This time, he was about to step into the heart of darkness, into Ohio State Penitentiary, one of the most haunted and notorious prisons in the world. Mr. Beast, along with his trusted friends, Chandler, Connor, Chris, Jake, Josh, and Tariq, was ready for something different, something that would push their limits of fear and curiosity. They packed all the necessary ghost hunting gear, EMF detectors, night vision cameras, infrared meters, extra batteries, and walkie-talkies. This wasn't going to be a regular YouTube challenge. It was going to be an experience none of them would ever forget. As they approached the prison gates, the air grew heavy, and the looming silhouette of the building seemed to hold centuries of secrets within its walls. The guide, an old man who had worked there for years, greeted them. He was the one who would lead them through the prison's haunted halls, but his warnings were far from comforting. The fire that claimed 300 lives back in the 1930s still lingers in this place, the guide explained. And before that, Countless souls perished here, some by their own hands, others in the violent rage of their fellow inmates. They say the ghosts of those who died still roam these halls. The guide's eyes darkened as he spoke about the solitary confinement cells where prisoners were left in isolation, the hospital where the sick and dying were abandoned, and the church where executions once took place. He warned the team never to wander off alone and never to make light of the place. They were entering a prison where even the walls seemed to whisper in the night. The prison's dark past. In the early 1900s, Ohio State Penitentiary had already been the site of many dark events. The prison was massive, with its 250,000 square feet spread out across 6 floors. The prison was notorious for its overcrowding, harsh conditions, and most notably, the notorious deaths that had occurred there. As Mr. Beast and his team entered the prison, they immediately felt the weight of history pressing down on them. The dark, damp halls stretched into the distance, and the air seemed to hum with something unseen. The guide, now standing at the entrance, waved them forward. "Go ahead and explore," he said, "but stay close. You never know what you might find here." The team set up their base camp in the center of the prison. The place was so large that they decided to split into 2 groups for the night. Mr. Beast, Chandler, and Tariq would explore the hospital wing, while Chris, Connor, Jake, and Josh would head to the solitary confinement block. Exploring the hospital wing. The hospital wing, once a place where the sick and dying were left to suffer, felt more like a tomb than a medical center. As they made their way through the old dusty halls, their footsteps echoed loudly in the emptiness. The faintest sound seemed magnified in the stillness. Chandler held the EMF meter, which began to beep, signaling that they were not alone. They pressed forward, with Mr. Beast keeping the camera rolling. Suddenly they heard a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible click. Chandler pointed the EMF meter towards the source, and the light on the device began to flash brightly. "That's strange," Chandler said. "No electrical source here. It's probably something paranormal." They moved further into the hospital wing and stumbled upon a room with a faded poster from a popular movie of the time. The room was eerily still, and as they examined it, a strange buzzing noise filled the air. It wasn't coming from any equipment. They checked, but the sound intensified as they moved deeper into the room. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. Chandler's breath became visible, and he shivered. "This is not normal," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. As they reached the back of the room, they heard a faint siren-like sound, an alarm that seemed to echo from nowhere. Mr. Beast turned his EMF meter toward the source, and it went haywire, the needle flickering wildly. They followed the noise, but as they rounded a corner, they realized they had somehow walked in a circle, ending up in the same spot they had started. Confused and unsettled, they decided to leave the hospital wing. The building, it seemed, was playing tricks on them. The solitary confinement block. Meanwhile, Chris, Jake, Connor, and Josh were exploring the solitary confinement block. The narrow, cramped cells were designed to house prisoners in complete isolation, many of whom went mad from the solitude. The place had a dark energy that seemed to suffocate them as they walked through the corridors. They set up their infrared cameras and began to film. As they spoke, they began to hear strange noises, scraping sounds from behind the walls and footsteps that didn't belong to them. Then, as they turned a corner, Jake screamed. "Did you see that?" he gasped. The others turned to see a tall, shadowy figure moving toward them, its features obscured by the darkness. The shadow seemed to glide, not walk, and it was coming straight for them. Before they could react, the figure vanished into thin air. They all looked at each other in disbelief, their hearts pounding. "That was real," Jake said, voice shaking. "We're not alone here." Suddenly the room grew colder, and Chris began to feel a heavy pressure on his chest. "I can't breathe," he said, his voice panicked. It felt as if the air itself was thickening around him. They decided to leave, but as they turned to head back, they saw the shadow again, this time standing right in front of them. Without thinking, they bolted, running back toward the base camp as fast as they could. A strange encounter. Back at the base camp, Mr. Beast, Chandler, and Tariq were trying to regroup, and suddenly their walkie-talkie crackled to life. It was Chris's voice, but it was filled with static. "Mr. Beast, you need to get back to us. Now." There was a pause, and then another voice, this one feminine and soft, yet chilling, came through the walkie-talkie. "It's raining," it whispered. Chandler froze. "Did you hear that?" he asked. It sounded like a woman's voice, but it was far too eerie to be real. They turned to leave and head toward the others, but the air outside had shifted. The wind howled, and rain began to fall heavily, as if the prison itself had decided to unleash its fury. The ground was slick, the thunder deafening. Leaving the prison. The crew rushed out of the building, eager to leave the terrifying place behind. But even as they stepped into the daylight, the memories of the night would linger. What had they really experienced? Was it the spirits of the prisoners long dead, or something more sinister? The footage they gathered would prove just how disturbing the night had been. Distorted shadows, strange sounds, and an atmosphere thick with fear. As they watched the recordings back, they could see the unexplainable occurrences, confirming that they had encountered something beyond the living. They had set out to explore one of the most haunted prisons in America, and they had discovered that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones you can't see.